off just welcoming you. Thanks so much for joining us, Nathan Doty and Kendra McEwen. And we are going to talk tonight about anxiety, the connection between anxiety and struggling kids who struggle to read, namely with dyslexia. So I'll just give a few kind of a bit of an overview before we look at today's talk information. And maybe we can just kind of introduce ourselves a little bit. Go to the next slide there, Kendra.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
There we go.
Great. So Kendra, I actually both work with Achieve New England. We're a practice based out in Concord, and we do neuropsychological, developmental, and educational assessments for kids. So I'm a child and family psychologist who specializes in neuropsychological assessment, which means I got my doctorate in child and family psychology, including therapy and other types of work with kids, and then specialized in the child and assessment of children and adolescents. And then prior to joining Achieve New England, I was at Mass General Hospital in the Learning and Emotional Assessment Program, which is really geared toward the intersection between learning and developmental challenges, whether they be dyslexia, ADHD, autism, the intersection between those kinds of neurodevelopmental concerns and social and emotional difficulties. So this is a great topic for both Kendra and I. Kendra, do you want to talk a little bit about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am an educational consultant with Achieve New England, which means I do language and literacy evaluations. I help families with school placement. I also do a lot of family and school consultation, school observations. And my passion is really in helping families sort of navigate this process for their children. And there's a pretty strong reason for that. So I got my master's degree through the Carroll School many years ago. I've since taught in 3 language-based programs, 2 of them public, one of them in an independent school. And I directed that program for quite a while. I also have 3 kids with special needs. So I kind of look at this process from the teacher's perspective, from the administrative perspective, and from, most importantly, from the parent perspective. I've certainly been in many of your shoes. And I made the jump from teaching to assessment because I really feel like it's important to really pinpoint and target areas for intervention rather than kind of throwing spaghetti at a wall and seeing what sticks for our kids. We certainly don't want to be throwing programs at them that aren't going to target exactly what they need. And assessment is really the key to that. And also, for helping families obtain more early intervention services, we certainly know that early intervention is the best. And it's great that we have so many screeners in our, screening laws in our state and across the country. But a lot of our kids, their needs are more complicated than what's going to be picked up by a screener. So that's where assessment really is the first step in getting effective intervention. And I'm really excited to do this talk because we know how important teacher and parent responses are to kids who struggle with anxiety and also struggle with reading. These issues come up in different ways for different kids. And in some cases, the emotional interventions are equally important to academic interventions. So I'm glad you all are here. Thank you for joining us.
Wonderful. So just to give an overview of today's session, we're really going to kind of focus on 4 main questions that we hope to kind of answer with our talk today. And with that focus on the social emotional well-being, we're really going to focus in today on anxiety because of the close connection between difficulties learning to read and anxiety. And so we'll start with sort of why students with dyslexia or other language-based learning disabilities are prone to increased anxiety or especially at risk. Then we'll kind of follow up with some information about how to spot anxiety and the many forms that it might take in struggling readers. And then also look in greater depth at how anxiety is going to impact the learning of a student when it's present, and especially if unaddressed, right? And then we hope to close on a positive note, which is knowing all of this, what can be done in terms of supporting, as whether we're educators or parents or providers, how can we support kids that are struggling with both dyslexia and feelings of anxiety?
So why are students with dyslexia at increased risk for anxiety? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but let's start with what we know. So we know that anxiety is 3 times more likely in students with dyslexia. The CDC estimates that about 9 to 10% of kids in the general population have a diagnosed anxiety disorder. But we also know that about 30% of dyslexic students have an anxiety disorder or really struggle with anxiety. So it's definitely a much higher rate among dyslexic students. And one of the reasons for this is there's kind of a bilateral relationship between reading problems and anxiety. So we know that reading problems cause anxiety. We also know that anxiety causes reading problems. So why can reading problems cause anxiety? Well, certainly difficulties in school, repeated failures with school experiences. I'm going to go into that a little bit more in a minute. And this anxiety that reading problems cause can then cause more reading problems. So the more anxious kids are, the more it impacts their reading performance. And this relationship has really been established not only through observation, not only behaviorally, but through neuroscientific research. So researchers know that there's kind of a neural signature. There's kind of a pattern of brain activity that we see in students with anxiety disorders or who are experiencing a lot of anxiety. And one part of that we look at is the enlargement of part of the brain called the amygdala, excuse me, which is highlighted in this little picture on the bottom of the slide. The amygdala is responsible for processing emotions, including fear. So oftentimes students see reading as a threat. They have a fear response, and that amygdala produces a fight, flight, or freeze response that many of us are familiar with. And researchers at Columbia University have used MRI imaging in the past few years, and they found that this neural signature, this sort of increased amygdala activity, is present in kids with anxiety disorders. And importantly, it's present in kids with dyslexia who don't have anxiety disorders. So in one study that they conducted, they actually screened out anxiety disorders from the dyslexic population that they put through these brain scans, and they still found this same neural signature. So we definitely know that dyslexic students, routinely experience a significant amount of anxiety. And this is really problematic for our interventions because this level of anxiety impacts students' responses to our interventions. And it leads to kind of a vicious cycle. So our students often get into what's called a cycle of repeated failures. When students first are starting to read, everyone's really excited. You see the eager, kindergartners and first graders learning to read. They've had a lot of success in their past experiences. They feel like they're going to overcome the success, these challenges. They're up for the challenge of learning to read. But over time, kids with dyslexia face repeated failures, right? They're trying to read, they're trying to follow along the general education instruction, and they can't due to factors that are beyond their control. So this starts to elicit some bad stress, right? They're not trying to overcome a challenge. Now they're trying to avoid a threat. Their brain starts to see reading as a threat due to the failure they've faced, maybe the humiliation they felt in class, peer and teacher responses to difficulty, and this produces a response of anxiety. And as humans, we're hardwired to retreat from threats, right? That fight, flight, or flee response that our amygdala elicits. So in some way, our dyslexic students start to avoid reading. They want to avoid something that's hard for them that they see as a threat. And this leads to a brief period of relief because they've avoided the threat. They've avoided that difficult task of reading, but over time, that avoidance actually causes their anxiety to intensify whenever they're faced with reading, and that leads to further anxiety, further avoidance, a little bit more relief, and then their anxiety once again intensifies. So that avoidance, I just want to touch on that avoidance piece. We know, sort of the general avoidance tactics that students might take, frequent bathroom breaks. A lot of our bright dyslexic students can kind of compensate and make it look like they know what's going on in the classroom for several grades. Shutting down. I actually heard a story the other day of a 7th grader who avoided reading in the classroom for years by taking a sip of water whenever her teacher looked like she was going to call on someone to read. So it would look like, oh, she's busy drinking water, I'm not going to call on her. And also, we often see kids pretending to read. And it also intensifies by the negative feedback that kids receive from often well-meaning teachers, parents, peers about their reading performance. And what we then see is the Matthew effect kicks in. So the Matthew effect says the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So our kids who are not experiencing this cycle may increase in their reading skills. They're going up and up. They're getting better, more skilled at reading. And our kids, our dyslexic kids who may be stuck in this cycle, their skills don't increase. So that gap between them and their peers widens, which certainly causes a lot of anxiety amongst our dyslexic students. This is especially true for our sort of compensator dyslexics who can fake it until 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, even 7th grade sometimes. And there are massive mental health repercussions for those kids who are going through this on a daily basis before they get, really good, appropriate interventions. And this also relates to the way that our special education system is set up. So it's really set up to keep the way it is now, to keep kids in this cycle until their reading skills or their anxiety or both gets bad enough that they qualify for intensive intervention. So this cartoon says his grades are fine. He doesn't need an IEP. Many of us have heard this in IEP meetings. And, certainly that's not an argument for why a child wouldn't qualify for special education services and really intensive reading interventions, but it often happens. And what this means is that by the time kids get appropriate interventions, they've been cycling around that cycle of repeated failures for years. And the negative emotionality that they're experiencing with reading at that point is really hard to unwind. It can interfere significantly with the effectiveness of the interventions that they're finally able to access. And a lot of times what we see in language-based programs is that we need to spend, up to a year really undoing the damage, the emotional damage that's been done for kids prior to them entering those programs, which certainly makes the interventions less effective and further delays their ability to respond to really good interventions. So kids are cycling through those repeated failures. They're coping with a system that isn't necessarily set up for their success, that actually serves to, at times, contribute to their anxiety. And adding to this stress is the presence of what many of us call dyslexia myths. I'm going to credit Joanna Christodoulou at MGH Institute of Health. She does a great presentation on dyslexia myths. And these are pretty prevalent in our society. We hope that with dyslexia legislation that's going on, that hopefully these will decrease, but they are certainly still present. So in 2010, this institute did a nationally representative public opinion poll, and they found that about half of the general public believes that a learning disability is a condition that can be attributed to laziness. More than half of the public, more than half of parents, about 43% of teachers, and about 1/3 of administrators believed that learning disabilities are caused by conditions at home. And about 20% of the public doesn't feel, or did not at the time feel, that people with learning disabilities are just as smart as you and me. So clearly our society doesn't have a great understanding of learning disabilities, including dyslexia, and that gets transmitted to students intentionally or unintentionally through teachers, parents, administrators, and especially as kids get older, through their peers. And that can look like bullying in a lot of situations. And this is also problematic due to a phenomenon called stigma consciousness. So this is the belief that others view you according to all the negative stereotypes associated with the group with whom you belong, whether or not you demonstrate those traits. So as kids get these messages, they may feel that even though these messages may not describe them, perhaps, oh, maybe I really do align with that. So these our dyslexic kids may be taking on the belief that they're lazier than their peers, they're less intelligent than their peers, and that their disability is caused by conditions at home rather than being neurobiological in origin, which we certainly know to be true, that it is a neurobiological condition. And they may, develop negative self-concept as a learner.
Great. So thanks. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about more about sort of peer and family and other types of relationships, because really kids that struggle with reading can have difficulty, often unseen challenges that really impact their relationships with peers and family members. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the nuances of that. So in addition to sort of the barriers that Kendra talked about around stigma, which are quite significant, there's other social impacts of dyslexia. And so relatedly, this concept of kids with dyslexia as being different and feeling different. The reality is for kids that have learning differences that just by nature of how they think and learn, there are true differences there. And those differences tend to come about and be most apparent at times that can be really challenging for kids. So for example, around second grade is when kids develop that ability to sort of look around at peers and say, how do I measure up? They start to really make peer comparisons. So if you see like a first grader many times or a kindergartner, they're not sort of looking and saying, how am I doing in the classroom relative to others around me? Whereas in second grade, the students begin to do that. And that's just at the time where the critical task of reading becomes so central to what they're doing in the classroom. The other piece is that another sort of juncture that from a developmental and social standpoint can be really critical is early adolescence. So at that age, kids move into a stage where they really want to be themselves, but be a part of the group. And we often see this in our early adolescence, that they want to express themselves, but they really don't want to stand out. They want to feel a part of the group. And that's also at a time for kids that have more significant learning disabilities that they may need even more intensive pull-out intervention. And so at the same time that a student in early adolescence, as they in middle school are kind of wanting to, not stand out from peers, there's elements of their educational programming that are making that very, very difficult. All right. The second thing that we kind of think about as an impact is that kids with dyslexia may have difficulty keeping track and keeping up. So what does that mean? Well, one of the things that's impacted by language-based learning disabilities like dyslexia is the ability to keep track of information, particularly verbally based information. And so if you think about how we as people make connections and grow our friendships, there's some real verbal demands to that. If I meet someone and I can't remember or quickly recall their name, that becomes kind of an instant barrier to that reestablishing closeness. By the same token, if they've given me information about themselves, largely verbally in terms of facts about who they are, what they think, or what they're interested in, and I'm not able to kind of quickly call those up and express them, that can kind of form a barrier in terms of my ability to kind of keep track of information to solidify my relationships. A lot of kids that have dyslexia struggle with other types of language processes, like retrieving information quickly or holding larger volumes of information in mind and formulating more complex language output, even when it's in a verbal form. And so if for kids that struggle with that, that can really cause an impact on their ability to keep up in conversational settings. And of course, as kids grow and develop, it's those verbal interactions that become really crucial. So a lot of times what we're thinking about in peer relationships with kids that have language-based learning disabilities is making sure that we offer other settings. For example, go take your kid and friends to go bowling, or find an activity that they're passionate about and really enjoy that doesn't involve a lot of conversation, because it helps kids to kind of make those connections during times when it's more difficult for them. The last piece is kind of the missing out component. And this can happen in a lot of different ways. I mean, one of the ways that even just at the upfront level is a student that maybe has to stay behind to finish up a test or get some extra help. And then they're missing out on missing like an assembly, right? I had a student a while back that the reading intervention for this student who was in 4th grade, the time that it was occurring was during homeroom, which was really the time when kids were sort of coming in at the start of the day, connecting with their friends, having those casual times to really make those closer friendships. And this kiddo was really missing out entirely on that because of some of the demands. The other piece is just to recognize that for kids that have learning disabilities like dyslexia, school takes more time. That's school, that's homework. And if it is taking more time, what that means is that there's less time for other things that help to round out their social relationships, like extracurricular activities or just spending downtime with peers, right? Next slide, Sandra. Thank you. It has to be one person on this formatting the way we do it. So, all right. So I also want to talk about some common challenges that dyslexia can actually cause in family life. And they're sort of interesting. There's probably ones that are more obvious and then things that we don't necessarily think about. And one of the common challenges for kids with dyslexia that can kind of show up at home, we'll have a kid that has difficulty following multi-step instructions, right? We have the kid that I call like the slowpoke, the kid that really needs that extra bit of time to get things done. And that might be happening in homework, but can also be happening in other areas of day-to-day life. And for many kids that struggle with reading, especially in those middle elementary school years, homework becomes a tremendous battle. Right. And so all of these factors can actually increase stress at home for a kid that actually really needs to be able to rely on close, connected, stress-free family relationships to try to help to bolster the challenges that they're having in the school environment. Some things that are a little bit less talked about. One of the things you can see there, I said, fighting the fast-paced world of family conflict. And this is just sort of an interesting nuance. Researchers have looked at families, videotaped them, coded their interactions, right, to understand how families interact with one another. And one of the things that happens for families is when we fight, right, when we get into a conflict or we're trying to resolve something, our pace of language actually increases dramatically. Right. And I'm a fast talker, so I always have to think about this, but our pace of language increases tremendously. And for kids that have language-based learning disabilities, it's important for us to be aware of these kinds of nuances in day-to-day life at home that may pose additional challenges. So just at that time that I'm getting really stressed out with my 9-year-old and want to make sure I get my point across about what we need to work on together, that's when that information becomes less accessible to them. Right. So there are other elements, though, that can kind of play a role in terms of family life. And this is kind of the family baggage, right, that goes along, not just with dyslexia. This can really happen with a number of stressors and disabilities, but it's certainly something that we can see for kids that struggle with learning because it's so central. The first is kind of like a sibling rivalry. A lot of times what can happen for a kid that may be struggling in school is that child needs a great deal more attention at that time from parents, right? And so that can create sort of a jealousy or a feeling of neglect sometimes from other siblings, right? And that can happen. On the other hand, a kid that maybe is really struggling with reading or another area of learning who has that older or maybe even younger sibling that finds it so much more, comes so much more naturally to them, that's going to create those sort of feelings of tension in even the sibling relationship. What we often see, and especially in our clinic, more times than not, because learning disabilities are so heritable, they're so genetically based, more times than not, when we're diagnosing a child, a family member will say, oh, well, that kind of sounds like me, or maybe that's Uncle Joe. Definitely to a T, really was a, amazing entrepreneur, but didn't really read so great and would always take things home to maybe have a friend or a partner read it. So those kinds of things are kind of prevalent in families, and it's important to note that there's kind of baggage that can go along with that. So sometimes for parents that have also had similar struggles, right, it can kind of go both ways. They may, on the one hand, really feel that child's pain very intensely because it's something that they went through. Whereas other times they may actually, because they've been through it and pushed through it without support or have difficulty recognizing some of those challenges, parents can actually kind of react in another way that may be more denial or even kind of anger, right? And so these are sometimes things when families are first coming to terms with a diagnosis that are a natural part of that process, but it can also be something that is a strain on the relationships at home. And then the last piece is sort of that a lot of times parents, because reading is such a central piece to day-to-day life and in education and academics, many families, and just like their child, can feel a sense of embarrassment or shame around this struggle. And that can even extend to sort of their desire to sort of maybe have extended family, for example, not be quite aware of these struggles. And so that in and of itself can kind of bring about struggles in family life. And also, as we kind of talked about, those feelings of shame and stigma that can occur, how we model these things for our kids makes a real difference. Next slide. So the other piece is sort of what I call kind of the strain of hidden disability. So we have looked at in research a number, endless amounts of life challenges or life stressors that people go through, ranging from disability to severe life events, anything like that. And what we've seen consistently is that identities that are hidden are actually far more stressful for people. That's one of the reasons that, if you look at the literature out there on really coping with severe illness like cancer, for example, one of the things is to share that with the people around you and not keep it as something that is hidden away. And there's many reasons for that. One is that we maybe not receive the support that we need, right? If we don't share that hidden identity. And then we may also have to kind of constantly be re-explaining it to folks if it's not sort of out there in the ether of something that we're struggling with. And so I always draw the comparison when we're thinking about kids with learning disabilities to a kid that might be, for example, with a physical impairment, such as a wheelchair, needing a wheelchair to get around. There's something about using a wheelchair for all of the challenges that go with it that's very visible, right? So you don't tend to see teachers or others at a school, for example, trying to get a child to stand up from a wheelchair if they're confined to it or really need to be in it for the majority of the day, right? On the other hand, for a child with dyslexia, that disability that they struggle with is not readily apparent to those around. And there's some really important implications to that. As I mentioned, one is this student may have what we call stealth dyslexia, where they don't get the support that they need, right? Even if they are getting the support they need, they may have difficulty accessing the emotional support that they need, even when interventions are in place, right? They may also have to kind of constantly, even into college years, we find this for students that they're constantly having to talk to professors or sort of come out in their lives as dyslexic, and that can occur into adulthood, of course, in our jobs and careers and day-to-day life. So that kind of needing to constantly explain or justify a disability that is hidden can be quite a chronic strain. There's also an element to learning difficulties in general that's different from, say, something like a physical impairment in many cases. If you think about a student that maybe on Tuesday came to school with their wheelchair, right? And then came onto school on Wednesday without it, right? That's a very uncommon thing. You might see a teacher saying, well, do you need that, right? If you don't have it one day, but you had it the next. This is what students with dyslexia go through all the time, because there may be times where there's something within their knowledge base that they can read or that they have mastered, but there are areas and pockets that have not been mastered by them. And so you see a great deal of inconsistency, even in their experience, a great deal of inconsistency and unpredictability, and whether or not they will succeed or fail at something. And so we have to be very, very mindful for students that have these kinds of hidden disabilities, that we're not looking at terms such as laziness or not trying, because when you see that kind of inconsistency, it can be a go-to for folks, especially if that disability is right? So also want to sort of talk a little bit about, in thinking about dyslexia, sort of pose a question, a thought question, which is, as we've moved into the 21st century, right, and a lot has changed in the last 22 years, but as we've moved into that 21st century, is living with dyslexia more challenging? And I think that it is, for a number of reasons. I think one of the things that we can start to think about, even prior to this 21st century, is that over the course of the previous century, previous 50 years, 60 years, we really made a move from a society that was by nature kind of a very hands-on and trade-based in terms of how people developed careers, right? So if you think about industry and building and things like that, and what's happened is a lot of those tasks that are, hands-on types of tasks that someone with dyslexia might really excel in, based on what we know about the strengths, is that those have been shifted oftentimes to computers. Right. And that shift to the information age has been really impactful, I think, for folks that have language-based learning disabilities. If we think about dyslexia as being a struggle between connecting symbols, right, with their sounds or meanings, right, because that symbolic piece is what creates the gap between that verbal communication and written communication. In a virtual world, what do we rely primarily on? Symbols. Right. And so if large amounts of information are coming our way and it's primarily in either symbolic or verbal format, that's more of a stress and a challenge for folks that have dyslexia. Right. Let's just think about remote learning and how difficult that was for many of our kids with dyslexia, because it relied so heavily on written language or verbal communication. Right. I will also, and if you just think about examples in day-to-day life with this, right? So like texting, emailing, now we're actually consuming a lot of our news online, right? Social media, all of these things are very much more focused on sort of verbal communication or written language, right? I do think it's important to acknowledge, though, that there are absolutely areas of strength that go along with dyslexia that we know about that can be real advantages and opportunities in this new age. One of the things that consistently comes up for folks that have dyslexia, we talk about, they oftentimes are connectors, right? So they're able to look at situations and see a problem or a challenge and figure out what is missing that needs to solve that, right? So we think about like the detective that can go into a situation and spot the thing that's missing, right? The firefighter that can go in and say, well, this is what doesn't look right, how the fire got started, right? Or the entrepreneur. I always like to say 3 of the 5 entrepreneurs on Shark Tank have dyslexia, that can go into a situation and say, this is what's needed to solve that problem, right? And when we're in a world where things are changing this quickly as they are in the 21st century, there are lots of those problems and gaps that need the connected thinking that happens for individuals with dyslexia. But I do think what we're finding is that this change is also creating greater stress for kids and adults that struggle with reading.
All right. So how do we spot anxiety in struggling readers? This graphic was actually on the Dyslexia Initiative Facebook page last week. It was on a recent post. And I think it's really important to highlight that anxiety doesn't always look the same in everyone. For kids in general, anxiety looks very different from the way that it might look in an adult. So we can all think about our partners feeling anxious, or ourselves as adults, or our coworkers feeling anxious, how that looks. And we may project that sort of that stereotype or that expectation onto our children. That's not always accurate. Kids don't always have the language or awareness to express what they're feeling. And that's especially true for dyslexic students. We can't expect that they're going to tell us exactly how they're feeling, exactly what's bothering them. And so they may express that anxiety in different ways. In kids, we often see that they experience physical symptoms like headaches or stomach aches, or engage in maladaptive behaviors before they're really able to articulate how they're feeling or where those feelings are coming from. And it's really important to note that a lot of the ways that kids express their anxieties are really easy to mistake for something else, like misbehaving, laziness, defiance, attentional challenges. So in this graphic, we see that amygdala response of flight, fight, and freeze. In terms of flight, we may see school refusal, we may see hiding, being overly restless or procrastination. Fighting may look like acting out, hyperactivity, defiance, screaming. And that freeze response may have them appear depressed. They may shut down at school. Or appear to be kind of zoned out or have attentional issues. And so, anxiety can certainly appear different for different kids. And it often looks behavioral. As Nate said, it's really important that we don't treat the behaviors. We need to treat what's causing those behaviors, and that's not often the case. And that's where assessment can be so effective. So we're looking at the cause rather than punishing the behavior, and assessment can really help us dig down into what that cause is. And Nate's going to talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, and one of the things to sort of understand, and I think what we've talked about is that it can look quite different depending on the child, this sort of fight, flight, or freeze response. And so one way to understand that, or that's an important way to understand how kids react, is this sort of concept of what we call internalizing or externalizing, okay? So some kids, when they get stressed, the way that they manage that distress is to internalize it. And those are symptoms like anxiety or maybe sadness or things that are sort of internal. Whereas other kids respond to stressful situations by externalizing, acting out on their environment or showing their distress in ways that are more overt. And what's interesting is that it's really important to understand these are not individual choices that are being made by kids. We can trace this tendency to either internalize or externalize all the way back to very, very early development. So kids who are not yet able to speak, there were some amazing studies that these poor kids, but they put the kids into situations that were kind of stressful, like maybe a kind of a large stuffed animal kind of coming at them and being right in their face, right? And so how kids might respond to that. And you have kids that are what we call high on BIS, or behavioral inhibition. Kids that have that behavioral inhibition system tend to internalize and they kind of shy away. Even early on in that development, kids though that have a BAS, or a behavioral activation kind of approach, will kick their legs and respond, and they're really into it, right? And so that sort of already gives us sort of a sense of how kids respond to novelty or something that might be potentially stressful or scary. How do they kind of react to that? And that carries on through development, right? And so the kids, they've done tons of studies looking at the kids that had that high BIS or the kids that had the high BAS. And what do you know? It looks the same in terms of their temperament throughout their development. So again, I think it's important for us to know that some of these students that are more prone to respond to anxiety with externalizing behaviors are not selecting these, right? These have to do with how their temperament responds to it from a very brain-based approach, right? So things like outbursts or tantrums, we might see kids being non-compliant or pushing boundaries. These are all externalizing kinds of behaviors, maybe having increased conflict. And the drive behind these, oftentimes what we find in our clinic when we see a student that's coming in with quote unquote disruptive behavior problems, many times there are underlying learning factors at play, especially if these are occurring at school or around homework. So you can think about the types of things that might fuel this. So kids that are struggling with learning to read may seek out opportunities to sort of be the class clown, right? As a way of kind of still connecting with peers and really identify with that. And then that can lead to kind of more disruptive type behaviors. They may become frustrated and have difficulty managing that and engage in sort of an angry or avoidant response to something that's challenging for them. What we also know is that for students that have dyslexia, especially, or other language-based learning difficulties, is don't tend to be great at retrieving and communicating information about how they're feeling. And so what can happen is that exacerbates the difficulties. And so while we might see some kids that are having disruptive behavior problems at home, or at school, there may be others that come home and have been kind of holding this in all day, holding it together, and get home and things kind of fall apart. right? So it's important to understand that just because these are externalizing behaviors doesn't mean they aren't secondary to anxiety or stress due to their difficulties learning to read. This is especially true for kids with ADHD because, and that happens in a third of kids with dyslexia, but ADHD really is a disorder. It affects attention, but it really affects kids and adults' ability to self-regulate or exercise self-control, whether it be over their thinking or behavior. And so if you struggle with that, and you also struggle with the stress of a learning disability, it's a tough combination because you're dealing with higher levels of stress than most kids around you, and those build up. And then at the same time, you have greater difficulty exercising control over those emotions, and then that can lead to this kind of patterns that we're seeing. The other thing I just wanted to touch on is that in many cases, and especially those where the learning disabilities go unaddressed, is we can start to see patterns of avoidance emerge around academics. And then sometimes we might see this for some kids where they are being undersupported or the situations would be too detrimental to their sense of self and well-being. This kind of can develop as actually initially an adaptive response, right? So I'm thinking about the kiddo sipping water, right? It's an adaptive response to avoid something that's highly anxiety provoking in the beginning, but at the same time, it becomes maladaptive with time because that kid's not getting the access that they need to the important areas of learning. This can actually, so we'll see this in school settings. What does this look like? Well, we might start to see this kind of avoidance as being like, oh, I need to go to the nurse, or trips to the bathroom, maybe being late to class or to school, or having absences that seem above what would be typical. And many kids, especially younger ones, and actually older ones as well, they may kind of take a form of somatic complaints. So stomach aches, headaches can be a way of, or especially for pain that's kind of non-specific. These are things to keep an eye out for as a way of sort of kind of detecting, as we've talked about, some of this anxiety. You might also see stalling or like avoidant kind of efforts during the morning hours. So it can be, or the nighttime hours before bed, trouble getting in the car, out of the car, shutting down during school and homework. And so like all of these things that we've kind of talked about, whether it be these fight, flight, or freeze behaviors, or maybe even some of these more avoidant or behavioral ways of them manifesting, are things to look out for, because they tell us that a kid may also be struggling with anxiety.
So we certainly know that there's lots of reasons and lots of ways that kids with dyslexia can experience anxiety, can manifest anxiety. And really, you know, the big question is, how does this impact their learning? So there's a lot of ways in which anxiety impacts and really impedes learning, which is problematic in terms of students' responses to interventions. One of the ways is that it's really hard for any of us to ignore negative emotions, right? We've all had the experience of being in a bad mood or being worried about something, and we can't really concentrate on anything else other than that negativity. And so it causes us, and it causes our dyslexic students, to redirect our cognitive resources. So instead of paying full attention and directing all of our cognitive resources to learning, right, we're redirecting them elsewhere. And that takes certainly the cognitive resources away from their academic tasks and the interventions they're receiving. So we certainly want to set up an environment for students with dyslexia, and really for all kids, where we can direct as many cognitive resources, as much cognitive attention to the task of learning and away from the task of anxiety or worries or social difficulties. So anxiety also impacts sort of frontal lobe function. So we know that the frontal lobe kind of goes offline in our brains during periods of intense anxiety. And this is the brain's control center, right? Our frontal lobe is really responsible for impacting the regulation of attention, for keeping ourselves organized, planning, engaging in goal-directed behavior, like engaging in reading interventions. And when we experience intense anxiety, when our dyslexic students experience intense anxiety, that frontal lobe doesn't function the way that it would otherwise. And so that impacts students' attention, and it impacts their working memory. Working memory is the capacity to hold onto and manipulate information in your mind. And it's really, really important in school, right? Dyslexic students already struggle with working memory. So in our testing, we often see lower working memory scores to begin with. But as they're experiencing anxiety, it causes them to be able to hold less information at a time, lose their train of thought as they're working. And this absolutely affects the effectiveness of our interventions. And anxiety really importantly impacts reading ability. So some research out of BU, Boston University, and Wheelock found that as first to third grade students performed an oral reading fluency task, their oral reading fluency actually went down when they were experiencing feelings of anxiety. So our reading ability is certainly impacted by these stressors that our dyslexic students face. And this is especially important to remember that academic interventions are necessary. Clearly, we want effective, intensive interventions for our dyslexic students, but they're not always sufficient. They're not always enough. And it's really important to address not only learning difficulties, but also any anxiety that's experiencing in conjunction with or because of those learning disabilities. So as promised, we are going to end on a hopeful note. What is to be done? Well, there's a lot of things to be done. One of them, the obvious one is school-based supports. So lots of resources available through schools. Schools often have a counselor, school psychologists, adjustment counselors, all there to support students during school hours who are experiencing anxiety. And this can be on a student service delivery grid in their IEP. These services are often generally available outside of the IEP as well. So if your student is only on an IEP for reading, say, they're still able to access these services if you work with the school for them to do so. They can be accessed through general education. Certainly things like timeouts, movement breaks, having kids go for walks. A lot of classrooms have calm down corners or mindful coloring available, sort of things to take students' minds off of what is going on that's causing them anxiety, redirect their cognitive energy to something else so that they can kind of reset when they come back. That's really important. A lot of schools are implementing social emotional learning curricula, especially in this post-pandemic world. And even service dogs. I've seen a lot of schools that have service dogs, which is a great way for students to kind of reset and sort of re-regulate their nervous systems as well. The really important thing to know, though, is that school-based supports are not targeted towards sort of an intervention in which their anxiety is going to ultimately decrease. Schools are charged with getting kids through the school day. So if their anxiety is causing them to have difficulty getting through the school day, have difficulty accessing learning, schools are there to provide accommodations and to do what they can to get kids to access learning and through the school day. Which means that the responsibility of really alleviating anxiety often falls to families and leading families to need to kind of seek outside help.
So right. And so I think that's something a lot of times families sort of find themselves in a place, and many of the families that we see finds themselves in a place of, is this academic anxiety that really can be addressed through this increased support at school, or will it resolve if we provide the right kind of interventions, or the child is in the right kind of placement and programming? And we do at times see that, but of course, like any kid, a kid that has dyslexia may not be immune to having more pervasive struggles with anxiety. That does occur. And so that's when you as a parent or a family member or provider, or even an educator, may look to how can we help this child get some additional outside help. The good news is that treatment for anxiety has been very, very well researched, and it works. even relative to other emotional challenges or social difficulties, treatment of anxiety is effective when it's done correctly. There are many out there, and there's some new wave treatments. Most of the really effective interventions for broad anxiety are based on cognitive behavioral therapy. So what is that? It's a treatment that is really designed to address the underpinnings of anxiety. As a side note, it also works in a similar way for underpinnings of a depression or other kinds of emotional difficulties. But what it looks at is right in the title. So cognitive and behavioral. So what we often find with anxiety is that there are cognitions or thoughts that exacerbate anxiety or either trigger or make it worse, right? So if we're thinking about a struggling reader who's experiencing high levels of frustration, an example of a thought might be, I'm really never going to learn to read well, right? Another anxiety-provoking thought may be, everybody's like looking at me and thinking that I'm not smart, right? And so these kinds of cognitions are things that can trigger anxiety and perpetuate it. And then what often happens is, because we have that sort of fight or flight response, is that we then develop behaviors that tend to maybe give us some relief in the short term, but that are not so effective in the long term with our anxiety. The big go-to oftentimes is avoidance. So what we see for whether you're anxious about reading or getting on an airplane, right? The cognitions are there and making it seem perhaps more daunting than it needs to be, right? Or at least getting in the way of effective and resilient thoughts that could be there. And the behavior tends to be avoidance, right? And so the more we avoid something, the less likely we are to develop competence and feel confident with it, right? So that's really kind of the core of most anxiety research, at least that's most research supported. So this is sometimes done in schools if it's needed, but in most cases for this kind of targeted treatment, you would be seeking that through an outside therapist. One of the ways that I often sort of talk to families about thinking about that option is, how is the anxiety manifesting? Is it just happening in the school setting around reading, or are you seeing more anxious signs in day-to-day life? So is it generalized to seeming nervous about new activities, maybe separating from caregivers or doing something for the first time, or even just sort of unfamiliar situations? Are we seeing anxiety in those? Because then that might be the kind of anxiety that we would look at treating more broadly and would seek out mental health services outside of school. The last thing, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, primarily because we're going to talk about medication, but primarily when we are looking at medication, the first thing on that list of questions that we should consider is, have we implemented all other feasible supports, right? We wouldn't want to be medicating, especially a child, in order to accommodate something that's wrong with the environment or not right with the supports that we're giving them, right? And that includes, so if you're making that consideration, we would also want to be at that point looking at outside treatment, right? Are all those things in place? Then I usually talk with families about 3 additional questions that can kind of help in this consideration. The first is there a safety concern? This isn't typically something that comes up with anxiety, but is the child's symptoms causing safety? So a kid that's really, really impulsive and just cannot keep themselves safe in day-to-day life, right? And we also would want to think about safety concerns on the other side of their aspects of this child's profile that maybe would make them not a good candidate for medication. So those are sort of things that we grapple with to start. The other thing is we look at the child's level of duress, right? So if we have a child or an adolescent that's experiencing really severe anxiety, and we know that there is a treatment, we've done everything else, and there's a medication treatment that could help, and a child or an adolescent is suffering, then that to me becomes something more compelling, right? And then the last one that I tend to look at is, are critical milestones being missed? So if there's a young person and we put all these supports in place and their anxiety is so severe that they're not able to get to school, that's causing them to miss milestones. And what we know about these sort of developmental milestones, whether they be, making progress toward reading, progress in friendships, engagement in day-to-day activities, is that they're cumulative. So if a child falls behind or an adolescent falls behind, it's much harder for them to catch up. And that kind of can raise our sense of urgency about preventing.
So a topic near and dear to my heart is parenting the dyslexic child. So certainly we can seek outside supports for our dyslexic children, but also as parents, we have a lot of responsibility in this as well. So my first, piece of advice for parents is always to make sure that you have a solid understanding of your child's specific areas of struggle and educate, you're kind of charged with educating professionals on your child's strengths and needs. So teachers are not always trained in the way that that other professionals, general education teachers are not always trained in the way that special education teachers might be trained. Even your child's, coaches or outside activity facilitators may not have the expertise that you have in this. One complicating factor in this is there's a lot of language in the field of language-based learning disabilities, and it can be very complex to understand. So it's really important to seek out resources that enable you to really comprehend what's going on with your child specifically. Along those lines, it's really important to find support for yourself. It's very hard to go through this journey alone, and certainly not something that is necessary for you to do. I always encourage parents to seek out other parents in their district or school or town that may be experiencing this journey as well. Seek out trusted professionals who are able to educate you and your family members and your children about their learning difficulties, and certainly rely on other family members. Really important to gather a team. I often hear parents or families say that they're on team so-and-so, or they're gathering so-and-so's village. And this sets a really great tone that you are not alone and you don't have to carry this burden on your own. One thing that you can do at home is to kind of shift your language. So kids are very adept at seeing through empty compliments, like saying, "You're so smart." And this is true at school. It's also true at home. So I really encourage parents to avoid language that's overly broad or general that kids may perceive as insincere. So instead, we really want to get our kids thinking about self-reflection and what they are good at, and really practicing self-validation versus seeking validation from their teachers or from their parents or from their friends. So some great ways to do this are to say, what did you work hard at today versus what did you accomplish today? What about this assignment are you proud of? Our students often ask, did I do well on this? And I like to turn it around. What are you proud of on this assignment, to really practice that skill of self-validation? Or I'm really proud of you for, and name something specific rather than I'm just really proud of you. I'm really proud of you for what? Short answers are okay. As Nate talked about earlier, expressive language can be a challenge with our students. And if we share the same profile as our children, it can certainly be a challenge for us as well. Another thing I encourage parents and teachers to do is to really normalize feelings of discomfort. So when you've gone through so much anxiety as a dyslexic student, you may come to really shy away from challenging experiences. And life is full of challenging experiences, whether you're dyslexic or not. So I find, especially as kids go towards middle school, go towards the middle grades, they're habituated to avoiding anxiety-provoking situations at all costs. And this really causes them to miss out on a lot of experiences in life and a lot of experiences that would otherwise boost their confidence. So I encourage teachers and parents to normalize talking about feelings of nervousness or discomfort, to help kids understand what are normal emotions, and that it is typical to feel nervous and uncomfortable in some situations. An example of this is, say, as a teacher, if you have a student who shuts down for MCAS, for example, not that MCAS is the be all and end all of anything, But it's an example of a situation where many kids shut down, where it's very anxiety provoking for a lot of students. So just previewing the emotions that they may feel, right? You're probably going to feel nervous at some point during this process. What are you going to do when you feel that emotion? And then finally, relentlessly seek opportunities for your child to shine. Extracurriculars are so important for our dyslexic students. It's often where they are able to really show what they're talented at. So whether it's dance, gymnastics, music, horseback riding, art, whatever it is, seek out opportunities to enable your child to be expert and to shine and to sort of build their confidence that way, because they may not be getting that at school. I also want to talk about the importance of finding what Dr. Robert Brooks calls a charismatic adult for your child. So I love the way that this is put, so I'm just going to read it aloud. All children with learning disabilities need charismatic adults in their lives at school. These are educators, and I will say it's anybody, not just educators, who enthusiastically and purposefully accept students for who they are and identify and reinforce the strengths of all students. They perceive all students as being capable of succeeding at academic and social demands, as long as they are provided with appropriate interventions. And I want to emphasize, this doesn't just have to be educators. This can literally be anyone in your child's life. I once had a student who was going to give a speech to the entire school. She was really nervous. I asked her what she needed. She wanted the school secretary. The school secretary was the charismatic adult in her life. And that, again, it can be a coach, it can be a secretary, it can be a paraprofessional, it can be a relative, whoever it is. Keep your child connected with that person even after they're not immediately in their life. If it's a teacher, keep connected with that teacher. So really important to find sort of a shepherd and cheerleader and intentionally invite that person into your child's village. And just to finish up, I love this graphic. I show it often. This was put together by someone named Laderick Horn. He's a great poet. He has some YouTube videos of sort of his slam poetry, and he grew up with learning disabilities and speaks frequently about that experience. And I love this because it really shows there's sort of two options, right? The two options are disability pride or disability shame. The option that is not available is that the disability doesn't exist, right? Our students, even if we're not calling it dyslexia, even if we're not saying something to them about their challenges, they know that they're struggling. And so really the only way forward for them to display sort of adaptive coping mechanisms and really accept who they are is through acceptance of their disability. So through acceptance, right, we get to self-disclosure. And this is what Nate was talking about, where students need to constantly come out as being dyslexic because it is a hidden disability. And it's really important for our dyslexic students to be able to practice sort of that coming out process. They can't always explain, they often can't explain what's going on, especially to their peers. Why do they need to be pulled out of class? Why are they getting specialized instruction? And when they can't explain that, it does cause increased shame, increased anxiety. What we all want for our students is for them to use supports and self-advocate. That's really, especially towards middle school, that's a huge push in school. And they really can't get there until they accept their disability and they're able to self-disclose and understand what it really means. And certainly that it doesn't mean that they're stupid. The other thing is that I love about this diagram is the importance of connecting to a disability community. I often see this attempts at this through explaining to kids about celebrities who are dyslexic, which can certainly be powerful. But I think what I've seen is that the more powerful factor is for kids to be able to connect with others in their community who share a similar profile to them. And just to end with some resources. So an organization called Eye to Eye was started by a very charismatic and funny dyslexic gentleman named David Flink. If you can see him speak, he's fantastic. I just put in a link there where you can bring an eye-to-eye peer mentoring chapter to your school. So this connects older dyslexic students with younger dyslexic students through activities versus just conversations, which Nate touched upon earlier. There is an organization called Noticeability, Noticeability and No Disability. They put out these great hats and t-shirts that say dyslexic before it was cool, which in itself is awesome. But they offer curricula in areas that dyslexics are often overrepresented in. So entrepreneurship, innovation, engineering, architecture, arts. They're doing a free promotion right now for a free training course for facilitators and parents of this curriculum. So that's something to check out for sure. Great book called the Dyslexia Empowerment Plan that I often recommend by Ben Foss. And then the International Dyslexia Association, among all of their great fact sheets, has a great fact sheet on stress, anxiety, and dyslexia.
Great. We had a lot to share with you today. So you may have noticed that we did not leave time for Q&A, mostly because we really wanted to cover all of this and also to have time to really talk about these areas of resilience and things that we can do to help. But both myself and Kendra can be reached through our organization, Achieve New England, and then also we're both involved with IDA. And if you are not a member of IDA, please consider joining us. It's a great way to keep up with these kinds of talks. And we do more and more these days. Are starting to do some really wonderful in-person learning as well, or in-person opportunities for folks too. So we know we've gone just a touch over time, but thank you all for sticking with us on this Tuesday night. It's Tuesday, right? Okay. Thank you so much, folks, for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.
Thank you all.